from Saul, in the midst of this, in the midst of that, all of these things, when he was in Gath, feigning that he was crazy, all of these things, he still let God use him and puts together a journal of some amazing things that in every respect, I'm blessed today, thousands and thousands of years later. That's what God does. That's David. What a rich contribution. Songs from time well spent with God. Psalms from trials that are so hard that he didn't give up. Songs of fellowship with God. All of these things is a reflection of his amazing time with his God. Again, God can do that for us. Has he ever put a song in your heart? Has he ever given you a poem? Has he ever given you something that just gives him glory because you know this is him doing this in you? We worship the Lord, and so many of these songs up here are because somebody went through a crazy trial, and God gave them a song that encourages us to look in the eyes of Jesus. Just that song. What's that like? So we have this thing, and we have David as many respects just a guy showing up. And then he says this in verse 2. He establishes who he is, what God's done. Verse 2, the Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. Wow. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me. We all know this was by labored prayer and supplication when the Spirit of the Lord spoke to him. David's takeaway was for Israel and us. As the Spirit of the Lord speaks to you, what do you walk away with? And his words were on my tongue. This is what's David's, these are his last words. These are David's last words. His word was on my tongue, and it's interesting what happens to us when we're balanced by him. What we can walk away with when we seek God's heart. Because of David's time with it all, look what he did. Because that's the whole part. He spoke to him, and David spoke to Israel. And today, David is even speaking to us. The example of what you can walk away with when you give God that time, that it really does take effort to hear from God. Why is that? Because it takes effort to hear from God. And when you hear from God, it's powerful. When you hear from God, it can be life-changing. It can be healing. It can be encouraging. It can be all of the above. We're balanced in him. What can we walk away with when we seek God's heart? I walk away with forgiveness that I never had. I walk away with encouragement that I could never get from anybody else. I walk away with conviction. I walk away with direction. I walk away hearing from God. But see, we studied the fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. That whole word fervent is work. It's hard work. It's hard work for us. Because the devil doesn't want us to spend time with God or hear from God. Because that makes us dangerous. That makes us effective. That makes us, in many respects, a forward movement. Because as Christians, we are supposed to be on the offense, not the defense. Verse 3 goes on. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his words were on my tongue. These are the words. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Here's David's summary. when he's finally became king, all the running and all the desperate and all the close calls and all the lessons of faith and trust, David is familiar with God's call. David is familiar with God. David is developed in many respects to be a good king because he's got a close relationship with God, because he was a man after God's own heart. David is familiar with God's call and God's voice and God's hand in his life and all the positions that he found himself in. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel said to me, he who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. See, this is David's takeaway in all of his experiences. I want to be a king that is just. And he was, in many respects. He was a good king. He was a humble king. And then it goes on. Verse 4, and he shall be like the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. This was the kind of king he was. Why? Because he learned so much. He learned so much by becoming, in many ways, totally dependent upon God. Totally dependent upon God. Because when you're backed in a corner where you've got nothing else but Lord help, when you're backed in a corner where death is imminent and you see God working things out that are way past you, when you have failed to pray and find yourself in a big predicament because you weren't faithful in prayer and God forgave that and restored you and fixed all these things, this is what God does. All of this, and the time frame is years. There was reasons for that. He was anointed king. He just didn't know when he was going to step into that role. Had no idea. So we have this whole aspect. And he shall be like the light of many when the sun rises, a morning without clouds. Can you picture this? God's faithful character. Because God's faithful as the sunrise. And here is a faithful sunrise without clouds. Here is a good day. Here is a day with the Lord. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Here is David picturing and painting this scene for us. God did this by such trial. God did this because of David's faithful character. God did this because David stayed true to God. Yes, he made mistakes, but at the end of the day, David stayed true with God and true to himself.